Call no one on earth your father. You have but one Father in heaven. So what do you think of that, Father Kevin? Sometimes when we call our priest Father, it seems, are we contradicting Jesus' words here? But of course, like anything, we have to look at what Jesus is saying in context, both particularly in what he's saying in this particular passage in Matthew, but also in the entirety of the New Testament. You see, in 1 Corinthians chapter 4, St. Paul exactly refers to himself as Father. He writes to the Corinthians that you have many guides, but only one Father. Am I not your spiritual father? He tells them. So, does that mean Paul is in blatant contradiction to what Jesus is teaching? Or is there another way to understand what Jesus is trying to say here? I think the key word for us is participation. Participation. That all of these roles and positions of authority that Jesus talks about, Father, Teacher, Master, that they're not for our own selves, for my own glory. It's not about me being in these positions to use others for myself, for my service of me. Rather, it's recognizing that my position is, in fact, a participation in the work of God. That if I live as Father, it's participation in God the Father, the one Father. Just like Jesus is the one light of the world, but we participate in that work in shining his light to the world, that he calls us also to be light of the world. Just like there's only one high priest, Jesus Christ, and his one priesthood. And yet we all, by virtue of our baptism, participate in, on some level, that priesthood of Jesus Christ. As we grow and move through life, we sort of grow in this participating in the work of God, especially as Father. As we enter into the world, we grow, we first recognize God as our Father, that we are his beloved sons and daughters, and that this is the foundation of who we are. God is the Father, and I am his beloved Son. I'm loved into existence by God for the sake of being loved. And when we have that foundation, then we can begin to share in God's work of love in the world. Primarily then, most of us are called then to marriage and to participate in his love as bridegroom. But participation in that we're to love our spouses with Christ and on behalf of Christ, together with Christ. Not simply loving them for Christ, but with the love of Jesus Christ. And of course, then that's all meant to be a generative love that goes to loving others as father and mother, participating in the very heart of God as Father. And that is something we are all called to. Married or not, our whole identity, all of our energies, all of our sexuality is meant to be oriented towards living and loving as father and mother. Spiritual fathers and mothers. So whether biological or spiritual, that's the movement of love in our heart that we're called to participate in. And it's important because it helps us understand then we have to look at who is God and what is his heart, because then that teaches me how I'm to live and love in the world. Who are you, God? Therefore, who am I? And therefore, how am I called to live and to love? Who are you, God? Therefore, who am I? And therefore, how am I called to live and love? Many times our temptation, which often leads to sin, is to invert that whole process. This is what I want for myself, therefore this is who I am, and then I'll sort of shove in God at the end. And in fact, then I'll just take the parts of God that are at service of what I want, and I'll just ignore the parts I don't like. It's very tempting to do. I take the parts of faith that I like, ignore the others, tailor God to meet my needs. That's exactly what Jesus is speaking against in our gospel today. Tailoring God to fit my needs, or using others to attend to my needs. Jesus is reversing that whole process. Who is God? God is your Father. He is your Master and Lord. And from that, everything else flows. Who are you, God? Therefore, who am I? Therefore, how am I to live? Participating in the love and the work of God as I live as Master and Father. So whatever place we find ourselves in the world, whatever position of authority or influence, whether as leadership, politically, or at my work as a boss, as an employer, or whether as a teacher, or of course, as a mother or father, as a parent. That we're to ask that question, how am I to live with God? How am I to use my position of authority and influence at service of others? Jesus tells the disciples, because the 12 apostles are given real authority, that Jesus invests in them. But he says they're not to wield that in a lordly way. It's not about you. It's about your position of authority is meant exactly to be at service of others. Looking at God the Almighty, all-powerful, who has sovereign power and authority, and yet who pours himself out to exalt and elevate us in love of us. So all of our positions of power, influence, and authority, power, by the way, is always meant to be at the service of love of others. How do I use my position in exactly to be a blessing to others? Because that's the reason we have positions of authority, to be public servants, in fact. So Jesus is trying to reorient, where is it I'm putting my eyes and placing my vision? Because our temptation is always to put it on ourselves first, and everything else in service of that. But rather, he calls us to true, genuine humility, to look away from myself. Genuine humility, by the way, is not to say, oh, I'm just a terrible human being, I don't have anything to offer to the world. It can be sort of a false humility, where we still are putting attention on ourselves. Look how horrible I am, and thus look how humble I am. Rather, true humility has to do with where are we placing our eyes? Am I still focused on myself? Or am I truly looking to God and what he calls me to, and looking out to the good of others? And in looking out to the good of others, then how do I genuinely recognize the genuine gifts I have, to name those and to then use them, again, not for myself or my glory, but use the gifts that I've been given to be gift and blessing to others, to serve and to exalt them. That's the humility God calls us to, Christ calls us to in the gospel today. To participate in his love, to turn our eyes away from ourselves, placing them on him. Who are you, God? Therefore, who am I? Therefore, how am I to live? And in that question, then, how do I use my positions of power, influence, authority, not at service of myself or my own gain, but truly at the service of love, like we just recently heard in the last couple of weeks in the gospel. To love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, to love your neighbor as yourself. That's what Jesus is driving at. That we may participate in his love, the love of God the Father. Amen.